What's up, guys? We're breaking down UFC Fight Night, Tsarukyan versus Gamrot, and we have another stacked Fight Night card lined up here. We did already have a couple of fights fall off, but overall the card's still looking very solid, even with the 12 remaining fights. And I was going to make a comment about how this card kind of has some tournament vibes with the number of fighters who have fought each other before and have shared similar opponents. Obviously not as applicable now that we've had a couple fights drop off, but what I was trying to get at here is, we have our main event headliner, Arman Tsarukyan, was able to get a knockout win over Christos Giagos a couple fights ago. And, Giagos is going up against Thiago Moisés, who's coming off of an absolute beatdown by Joel Alvarez, who, just so happens to have gotten absolutely dominated by Tsarukyan as well. So, it really goes to show you just how much of a force Tsarukyan is. And at such a young age, too, going up against another very high-level fighter in Gamrot. And a little further down the card, we do have Umar Nurmagomedov as well, coming off of a win over Kelleher, who's also fighting a little further down on this card. And then, of course, we had Elliot and Ulberg on the card as well, who had, actually just fought each other one fight ago. But yeah, it definitely seemed like there were some interesting storylines and matchups here. Really unfortunate to have lost the Albazi fight, though, because I do think the kid's a very intriguing prospect. Definitely one that's going to be flying a bit under the radar, especially since we do have two pretty hype prospects on the card in Shavkat Rakhmonov and Umar Nurmagomedov. But, just looking at this card up and down, it does seem like a pretty good card, pretty stacked. And then, of course, we have the numbered event coming up next week as well. So, two very good, fight night cards followed by a solid pay-per-view card. Anyways, we have a great lineup of fights here, so without further ado, let's get right into breaking this card down. And moving along, we have Vanessa Demopoulos versus Jinh Frey, and Frey's the minus 275 favorite. Demopoulos is the plus 235 underdog, and we'll start with Demopoulos, who is, mainly a jiu-jitsu fighter. On the feet, she is someone who will kind of just barrel forward and put some combinations together. But I'd say overall her striking is pretty limited. She's kind of hittable as well, defensively. Obviously got bombed on by Juarez, but, even on the regionals, she's getting touched up, with relative ease. She's got decent jiu-jitsu, I suppose, but she really does struggle getting the fight to the mat. I don't think her wrestling's that good. And she isn't even someone that really proactively wrestles either, right? Most of her fights are actually stand-up affairs. And sometimes, the fights do end up on the ground. Either her opponent takes her down or they get tied up and, there's a scramble or something and she's able to end up on top or, even just play guard on bottom. But, I don't think that Demopoulos is someone who is really good at, actively just pursuing takedowns. And she's going to be going up against Jinh Frey, who is, I'd say, a pretty plotty striker. She's got decent power, but, does seem a little slow in there. She has shown she could wrestle a bit and, Frey, she is kind of physical in there. But overall, I don't think she's particularly great fighter, if I'm being honest. She's kind of low volume on the feet, not very active on top either, but I feel like she's able to win a lot of her fights because she's just absolutely shredded in there. She's able to kind of just bully opponents, just out physical them. And this is a spot where I do think she can kind of do that. One, she is going to be the better striker too, so I think she's going to be able to land some pretty clean shots on Demopoulos. Demopoulos, isn't going to wear the damage too well, I don't think. And, I do think that Frey could potentially wrestle if she wants. She could potentially just take Demopoulos down and kind of just lay on top of her if she wants to play it safe. I think Frey should be able to just dictate where the fight will go, right? If she wants to keep it standing, she can. If she wants to take Demopoulos down, and control her there, she could do that. So, at first I thought the line was a bit wide, especially, considering this is Jinh Frey we're talking about here, but after watching tape, I do think that it's somewhat justified just because I do think that Frey could really control where the fight goes. Like, on the feet, I do expect her to win. And, with Demopoulos, she is someone who will play off her back as well. We saw in the McKenna fight and the Aldrich fight where, both of them were able to take her down and Demopoulos really wasn't trying too hard to get up. She was just trying to attack submissions off her back. And so if Frey is able to take her down, I think that she can kind of just lay on top of her, similar to what she did with Patello. So I really do think that Frey should win this fight. But, this is pretty low-level women's MMA, and, we've seen a lot of bullshit happen, right? Like, we could see Demopoulos potentially find the guard sub. That's definitely live in women's MMA. But she could also, I think, win a pretty bullshit, volume-based decision as well, right? Like, if it's 100% standing, I do favor Frey overall. But, Demopoulos, she is someone who will move forward and put some combinations together. She could just win, based on volume. But ultimately, I think Frey, is going to be landing some of the cleaner, heavier shots. Demopoulos, not the best striking defense. I could see, some of the punches Frey landing, getting through it and just kind of, whipping her head back. And, that's not going to look good in terms of, the judging and stuff. So I like Frey in the spot. I think she could outstrike Demopoulos. I think she could just outcontrol her as well. I just think that Demopoulos' game is, way too limited. She's basically a sub or bust fighter. And, I don't know if she's going to be able to find a submission against Frey in the spot. And, Demopoulos, she is going to be the much smaller fighter as well. Technically their frame, if you're looking at just their measurements, she's not that much smaller, but, in terms of how they size up, Frey is just going to be the way more, shredded up, way more physical fighter. So I think Frey should be able to really just control Demopoulos in this fight. So I'm going to go with Frey here, likely by decision. I don't think I'll be playing this fight, but if I did, it'd probably be Frey by decision for something small. If it's like near evens, I think that'd be, decent value. And I do think this fight likely goes the distance. I think the only person getting the finish here is probably Demopoulos if she's able to snatch up some fluky submission. But outside of that, I think it will likely go to a decision. And if that's the case, I do favor Frey to be winning minutes here. So I'm going to go with Frey by decision. And moving along, we have Mario Bautista versus Brian Kelleher. And Bautista is the minus 155 favorite. Kelleher is the plus 135 underdog. And we'll start with Bautista, who is, I'd say, a pretty solid volume striker. Lots of movement on the outside. Very dynamic striking overall. A good timing on that flying knee. And in his most recent fight, he did show an extra little wrinkle to his game. Granted, it was against a lower level guy, but it was good to see him, working in the wrestling and the clinch work. I think it just adds an extra layer to his game. Someone who I think is a very, good volume striker to begin with. I do think that it's a good sign for him. And, he is going up against Kelleher, who is, I'd say, a pretty proven veteran at this point, a bit of a journeyman gatekeeper, if I'm being honest. But, with Kelleher, I'd say he is pretty well-rounded, kind of dangerous on the feet. He's got some power. The guys can wrestle as well. He's got a very sneaky guillotine. And overall, I'd say Kelleher's just done a very good job of, beating guys who don't quite belong at the UFC level. But, the issue is, of course, looking at some of his, wins most recently, against Kevin Kroom and Domingo Pilardi, Ray Rodriguez, guys who really just aren't UFC level and I don't think are with the promotion any longer. And, you look at some of his, older wins, Hunter Azure, I'd say is a decent win, but that was a win he was losing up until he got, caught his opponent. And O'Day, which I'd say actually aged pretty well as well. But, O'Day was making his UFC debut and he did get caught as well. So, with Kelleher, I do think that most of his, win equity is in, either out wrestling guys or, just kind of catching them in something. And I don't know if that's a super high likelihood in this fight here. It is a potential, right? With Bautista, he has been clipped. He has been knocked out before. And with Kelleher, he does seem to have a bit of power in his hands. And so he could definitely hurt Bautista in this fight, maybe club and sub him. But I don't know if that's, super high likelihood. I don't know if he's going to out-wrestle Bautista. Bautista doesn't have the best takedown defense, but, he is one of these guys who's kind of hard to hold down. But, I don't know. This is a pretty weird fight overall just because, Bautista, I do think is, a pretty solid fighter. But Kelleher, he is a proven veteran, and, he has shown at this point you can't really count him out. But, I'm looking at the guys that Kelleher has beaten, and, I just don't know if Bautista's really falling into that category. I can see Bautista just kind of working on the outside and just being able to volume up Kelleher. And, I don't know if Kelleher is going to be able to implement his wrestling enough for him to either win a decision or, I don't know if he's going to be able to land a big shot to get Bautista out of there either. So I'm going to go with Bautista in this spot. I think he should be able to keep it standing. and be able to outstrike Kelleher. So official pick for this fight, I'm going to go with Bautista by unanimous decision. And in the next fight, we have Cody Durden versus JP Bays. And Durden is the -120 favorite. Bays is the +100 underdog. And we'll start with the slight underdog in Bays first. So Bays, yeah, he is a pretty solid wrestler. Very aggressive top game, nasty ground and pound. He will hunt the submission. And overall, is just, I'd say, a very dangerous fighter if he's able to get on top of you. But the issue with his style is, he's very prone to gassing. The guy does start very aggressively and, hasn't done a great job of pacing himself. And, with Bays, I really don't think his striking is all that good. He's a little plotty on the feet, very hittable. Doesn't really move his head at all. The guy's got an extremely weak chin, dropped 7 times in his last 2 fights. So, yeah, while the guy is dangerous on top, I'd say he's pretty limited outside of that. And, he's going up against Durden, who I'd say fits a very similar archetype, a wrestler who has just been finishing guys early on the regionals. He's able to take him down, just pound him out or submit him. But, the cardio is not the best. However, I'd say for this matchup, it's probably better than Bays. The boxing, I'd say, from Durden is a bit better as well. I'd say Durden is a little more fluid on the feet, a little taller, a little lankier as well. But ultimately, I do think it's a pretty competitive fight. I kind of favor Durden a little bit more if it goes to a decision. But I think that, Bays has a little more finishing upside, especially early in the fight. Durden, again, is the better striker, but I don't see him winning by a wide margin there, and same with the cardio, right? I think it's slightly better, but, not by a wide margin. Durden, he has gone to a couple decisions at the UFC level, but, I don't think they were particularly great performances, though, right? He was getting completely pieced up at distance by Gutierrez, was able to backpack him that first round, but outside of that, wasn't able to get much offense off. And then the guy was just completely running on fumes against Orichi Lang, who is, I'd say, a gasser as well, right? And he fights well, into fatigue. But, that was a fight where it just got very, very sloppy, after that 7-8 minute mark. However, despite all of that, I still feel that on paper, Durden is probably the side just because, I feel like we've just seen so many more red flags from the Bays side, right? One, the guy's got extremely poor striking defense. He's kind of chinny, and, the guy's got really poor cardio. But, the issue with this matchup is I'm just not sure if Durden is going to be able to really capitalize on that. Like, I don't know if Durden is a good enough striker to, find the chin of Bays here and put him out, or at least hurt him badly. I don't think the cardio of Durden is good enough to the point where he's going to be able to just break Bays in there like maybe some of his previous opponents. And between the two, I'd say Bays has definitely looked, far worse in both of his UFC fights, far more disappointing performances. It shows up against Silva, basically just gets outstruck there, doesn't even attempt to take down. And then, he fights Montel Jackson, which, not a great matchup for him whatsoever, up a weight class on short notice against a much bigger Jackson. But, something to note in that fight is that Bays actually was able to take Jackson down, get in a very dominant position, had him mounted, even had his back at one point and had a submission locked in, just wasn't able to convert because he was just giving up way too much size, Jackson was able to fend those off pretty well, but, Bays was able to get into some very dominant positions, and I do think that, he can do this in this fight as well. I kind of rate the overall wrestling and grappling of Bays a little bit more. It's just that he seems to fall off pretty hard after that first round and a half. So, man, it's a really tough fight because, on paper, I kind of favor Durden just because I think that, if he's able to survive that first round, he could make it competitive. But at the end of the day, I don't know if he is going to be able to survive that first round. And even if he is, I don't think it's a guarantee that he'll be able to pour it on in that second and third round because Durden is a bit of a gasser himself. And so I can see that second round being very, very competitive, even if Bays starts to slow down a bit. So I think I'm going to go with Bays in this spot. I think he's got a couple paths to victory here. I think he could potentially get the early finish, and I think he could maybe somehow win, 2 of the 3 rounds, if it makes it out of that first round. So I'm going to go with Bays. Official pick, first round submission. And this is a fight that I kind of do favor to go under, even though it is a flyweight fight. just because Bays has kind of been a killer be killed fighter. However, I still don't know if I'd really touch the over-unders just because Bays, he could slow it down a bit more. He did actually survive to a decision against Montel Jackson somehow. So yeah, I feel if he starts to shore it up a bit, pace himself more, he could just go to a decision here. But I do think he could also find a submission or an early finish if he's aggressive. So, a few things could happen. And, lastly, I'll say this too, right? Because Bays, he came into the UFC not fighting the best game plan, fighting mismatches. So, now that he's, I'd say a little more settled down, fighting at an actual camp now, I think he's going to give, I'd say, a better account of himself. But official pick again, I'm going to go with Bays round 1 submission. And moving along, we have Raulian Paiva versus Sergey Morozov, and Morozov's the minus 135 favorite. Paiva's the plus 115 underdog. And pretty intriguing matchup here. Morozov, I'd say a pretty solid fighter coming out of the Russian regionals. Pretty well-rounded. I think his striking is kind of serviceable, but obviously he's doing his best work when he's able to mix in the takedowns. And, he is pretty good at chaining takedowns together, controlling opponents, and, does a great job of just mixing it all together. And he's going to be going up against Paiva, who I'd say is pretty well-rounded as well. More so a striker, but, he has shown that he can grapple a bit as well, can fight in the clinch, and does seem to be pretty good in scrambles also. Paiva, he's also, really tough. The guy's got some insane forward pressure, pretty good volume and pretty solid conditioning overall. But, we don't have too much footage of him at 135, only a couple of fights. One against Phillips, who, put an absolute beating on him in that first round. But, Phillips tired out, and Paiva was able to win the last 2 rounds. And then, he gets finished early by O'Malley in that first round. So it does feel like we still have, some questions about Paiva at 135. At 125, he did seem like a bit of a weight bully, a size bully in that weight class. But, taking a look at this fight here, I do think it's going to be a pretty evenly matched fight. I kind of favor Paiva in the striking a little bit. And Paiva, he does seem to have decent takedown defense and get-ups. So I can definitely see a path to victory here for Paiva. But, I don't think Paiva is going to win very dominantly standing either, though. So I do think Morozov can make it competitive and maybe use the takedowns to look to swing rounds, even if he isn't able to get a ton of control time. But again, this comes back to, not having a ton of footage of Paiva, at 135, stuffing takedowns and working his way back up. And Morozov, he has fought at 135 and has had a lot of success, out wrestling and out grappling guys. And we saw in the Kyler Phillips fight, even a gassed out Kyler Phillips was able to take Paiva down and control him for a bit as well. So I think Morozov can have enough success there to win. So I'm going to go with Morozov to win by decision here. But, I'm not super confident just because, Morozov, I do think's got some potential chin concerns. He got hurt pretty badly by De Silva, his last fight, on a number of occasions, actually. He's been hurt before as well, so I got some concerns about Morozov, and that was, I'd say, a pretty alarming performance as well, right? He had De Silva hurt, but I don't know if it's because he just completely unloaded the tank or if he doesn't have quite as good of cardio as I thought he did. But, the guy completely fell off a cliff after that first round. And while he did look good against Khalid Taha, his only win in the UFC, Taha doesn't seem to have a very good ground game. If you take him down, you could likely control him. And then, prior to that, he was getting knocked around by Umar, which, can't really fault him too much for that. Umar, pretty legitimate prospect. So overall, while I do kind of favor Morozov here to win, I'm not super confident in him. I do think that he still is somewhat unreliable. I'd like to see a little more footage from him at the UFC level before really committing to him. But the pick is going to be Morozov. I think the wrestling is going to be enough for him to win this fight here. So I'm going to go with Morozov. Morozov by decision. And in the next fight, we have TJ Brown versus Shayilan Nuerdanbieke. And Brown is the minus 210 favorite. Nuerdanbieke is the minus or plus 180 underdog. So we'll start with Nuerdanbieke first. And, first of all, I just want to say this guy is an absolute unit. Ridiculous torso on him. But with that out of the way, I just have to say this guy is a terrible fighter. Big power punches on the feet, but I'd say he comes up short on like 80% of his strikes. He's super strong and physical, likes to wrestle, but the guy's got absolutely no cardio. He could style on these bums in China who can't wrestle. But, we saw how ineffective his wrestling was, past that first round against Kulabao. He was able to outpace, Soriano on the map, but, Soriano's got absolutely no ground game and no cardio either. So I'd say a win over Soriano at this time really does not mean much, especially since Soriano's out here, losing to random 500 fighters over at Eagle FC. So, I don't think it's a win that's aged particularly well, if I'm being honest. So Nuerdanbieke, I don't think is a great fighter, but, he is very physical. Does seem to be an okay athlete. But he's going to be going up against Brown, who has, a wrestling base, decent boxing as well. Talked a bit of shit on him last time in his last fight. Some guy got real upset about it, but honestly, my thoughts on Brown is just that I think he's a somewhat inconsistent fighter and, low-key a bit of a gasser as well, right? Because you kind of look at the body of work he's had so far at the UFC level. He's debuting against Griffin, and, he looks great in that first round with the wrestling and stuff, but he slows down, gets sloppy, and eventually gets caught in the guillotine. Danny Chavez, I think this is the next fight. I feel like, coming off of that performance, he overcompensates a bit and doesn't really shoot any takedowns until it's a little too late, right? The legs are already kicked out of him. Ends up winning the last round, but, it's a little too late. And then, his fight against Kamaka, put on a solid performance. It was a very close fight, but, arguably should have lost that fight as well. So, just not a ton of very, convincing performances from Brown, in my opinion. But I do really think he should win this fight. I think he's the more skilled fighter, more well-rounded fighter. Nuerdanbieke might, have a good first round, and I could potentially see him winning that first round, but I don't know if he's going to be able to keep up with Brown here. I think Brown should have the slightly better cardio. I don't think Brown's got the best cardio, but I do think it's going to be better than Nuerdanbieke here. So I am going to go with TJ Brown to pick up the W here. I think that coming that second and third round, I think his wrestling and the volume is going to take over. You look at the fights that Nuerdanbieke's in, the guy's landed 34 significant strikes in 2 fights, which means, it's 17 per fight. And that comes out to just above 1 significant strike landed per minute, which is absolutely pathetic. So I got to go with TJ Brown here. He's fought better guys in there. I'd say better skill set overall and just better cardio. So I do think TJ Brown likely takes over second and third round and likely wins a volume-based decision here. So give me TJ Brown. Give me TJ Brown by unanimous decision. And in the next fight, we have Tafon Nchukwi versus Carlos Ulberg. And Ulberg is the minus 135 favorite. Nchukwi is the plus 115 underdog. And we'll take a look at the underdog in Nchukwi first. So, Nchukwi, he's, I'd say, a very big physical fighter. A bit plotty on the feet, but, he does do a decent job, doing attritional damage, working the legs and the body kick. He's got a pretty sneaky head kick as well. He does seem pretty strong in the clinch, decent power there. And, I'd say the cardio from him is solid. I'd say, given the power that he throws with him, the output that he has. And from what I have seen, he does seem to have a little wrestling upside as well. Don't think it's a big part of his game, but it is something that I've seen him attack. And he's going to be going up against Ulberg, who is, I'd say a pretty decent kickboxer. It's hard to really gauge how good he is, though, just because I'd say he's fought, relatively low level of competition. And a lot of the fights as he's been in at the UFC level were, against hand-picked opponents, which, not a great sign, right? The guy's definitely getting coddled a bit, but does seem to be pretty good offensively. Measures distance well, good footwork, lateral movement, good use of the feints, does a decent job of fighting long, pumping out the jab and the kicks. Just, he's got a style very, similar to the guys coming out of, city kickboxing. But, the issue with Ulberg is, he still is kind of green, I'd say. And again, just hand-picked opponents. So, they're picking guys who they think he's going to do well against. But overall, he does seem to pass the eye test and does seem to be, pretty solid offensively. Now, taking a look at this fight, I think it should be pretty competitive. I kind of favor Ulberg at distance. Nchukwi has kind of struggled with the jab a bit, and Ulberg, he is, I'd say, a pretty long fighter, and he does pump that jab pretty consistently. Nchukwi does get countered a lot as well, because he throws a lot of naked leg kicks, which I can see Ulberg having a bit of success doing as well. And I do think Ulberg is actually going to be maybe the quicker guy, quicker hands, despite being the taller guy. So I think Ulberg should be able to do work at distance against Nchukwi. I think he's got better footwork as well. Nchukwi, he could have, success in the clinch for sure. He's a very big, strong, physical guy. I can see the body kick being a thing for Nchukwi as well, especially when Ulberg decides to switch stances. So he's going to have those body and leg kicks being open in that open stance. But overall, I kind of favor Ulberg just a little bit more. Especially at distance. I can see the speed, the footwork, and the distance management being just a little too much for Nchukwi. I think that Ulberg should be able to outpoint Nchukwi here. But of course, I do think this is a decent step up in competition for Ulberg, who hasn't really been tested. But the fact that they're kind of letting this guy, handpick his opponents makes me think that, their camps probably got something drawn up for, how to deal with Nchukwi here. And, it's not like Nchukwi's some like enigma of a fighter, right? I think he's a pretty basic fighter, pretty, limited fighter that they could probably game plan around, for Ulberg. So as far as like the narrative goes, I'm going to side with Ulberg here, but I do think that in terms of, stylistics, I think that Ulberg could just give Nchukwi a lot of trouble here. So I'm going to go with Ulberg, probably by decision here. I honestly don't know if I really want to touch the time props for this fight either, just because, I don't really trust the durability of these guys. Both guys, they have been hurt, have been finished before, and both guys do have, decent power, right? So I think that someone could land big and hurt the other guy, get him out of there. But I think this fight likely goes to decision, though. I think Ulberg probably just looks to outpoint Nchukwi here, pace himself like he did against Charant, kind of just stay on the outside and just pick him apart. I think that now that we've seen Ulberg start to, pace himself a little better and not just go guns blazing out in that first round, he'll have a much better chance at, I think, winning a decision here. So I think we see Ulberg just stay on the outside, work the kicks, work the jab, just kind of work Nchukwi at distance here. So give me Ulberg by decision. And in the next fight, we have Curtis versus Rodolfo Vieira, and Curtis is the -150 favorite. Vieira is the +130 underdog, and very intriguing matchup here. Your typical grappler versus striker matchup. And we'll start with Curtis, the Action Man. Very apt nickname. The guy is riding a bit of hype. Coming into the UFC with 2 knockouts against I'd say pretty legit fighters in Phil Hawes and Brendan Allen. Curtis, he is a good boxer. He's got good quick hands, good combination punching, and does seem to be able to carry his power later into fights, right? We've seen him get a number of, later finishes in that second and third round, but he's gotten early finishes as well. So, I do think he's a pretty dangerous guy, in all phases of the fight, which is interesting, right? Because I actually don't think that Curtis, he's got the greatest cardio in there, but, he does seem to be able to still get those, later knockouts. And he is going to be going up against Rodolfo Vieira, who is an elite submission grappler, very accredited outside of the octagon. But, I'd say his striking has been making improvements as well. Nothing special that he's doing in there. He keeps it very simple, but he does do it pretty effectively, right? We saw in the Stolze fight, he was doing a really good job of just, pumping out that jab, throwing 1-2 and that leg kick, which isn't really anything, special, but, he does it very well. And, his grappling really opens it up as well for him. So, kind of good to see from Vieira, but it's still a pretty limited sample size. But with Vieira, he does have decent wrestling, really good timing on the level change. And, he is a very strong, very physical guy who, if he is able to get on top of you, he is very aggressive, with the ground and pound and the submissions. But the issue with that is, the guy is a gasser, right? He can't really sustain that sort of, grappling pace for more than a round, maybe a round and a half, which is kind of why I think we're seeing him really work on his striking. And that's because he's really just incapable of, I'd say, grappling more than, a round and a half. So it is a very interesting dynamic here, I think. Right, I think if Curtis is able to keep it standing, he does have a very good chance of just outboxing Vieira. Whereas with Vieira, I'd say it is a little trickier for him because, obviously he does want to grapple here, but the cardio is a concern. So he's going to have to walk, I'd say, a really fine line between, when to grapple and when to strike. So it does put him in, I'd say, a pretty tough spot, right? He strikes too long, he potentially could just get clipped and knocked out. But, if he grapples for too long, he could potentially just gas out, which, I think is just as bad. And interestingly, I do think that if Vieira just completely sold out for the sub, went and, just took Curtis down and really, attacked it aggressively, he does have a really good chance of finding the submission. But I think that he might just be a bit scarred from that Hernandez fight where, Hernandez was just beating the shit out of him and eventually choked him out because Vieira sold out a little too hard for the sub there. And so I could see Vieira just being a little more reserved in this fight. But, I don't know if he'll have too much issue taking Curtis down. Curtis, he really struggled keeping it standing, against Magomed Karamov, over at PFL. And, that was at 170. And Magomed, he is a good wrestler, though, but, Vieira is going to be the much bigger guy going in this fight, much more physical. And Vieira, he is an elite grappler. So if he is able to take Curtis down, I think he could potentially find the submission. But overall, I don't have the best read exactly for this fight, just because I do think this is a pretty volatile fight. I think we could see a number of outcomes here. I think Curtis, we could see him, get the knockout against Vieira. I think he's the better boxer. And if he is able to stuff a few takedowns, or, even if he is taken down and, he's able to stay safe, I could see him, working his way back up, or, surviving that round and, just being able to put his hands on Vieira, if Vieira does have those unsuccessful, grappling attempts, as he starts to slow down. So I could see that happening. I could see Vieira just finding the submission as well. I think he could just muscle Curtis to the ground and submit him there. So I do think a finish is kind of likely for this fight. So yeah, I don't think this fight will go the distance. I think that either Vieira finds the submission or Curtis finds the knockout. But official pick, I think I'm going to go with Vieira here. I think that the gap on the ground is way bigger than it is on the feet. I do think Curtis is the better boxer, but I think that Vieira could potentially have some tools on the feet that could allow him to kind of, extend the fight a little bit. And I don't think that Curtis is going to completely demolish Vieira on the feet. Whereas if this fight does hit the ground, I kind of favor Vieira by a much larger margin to be able to find the submission if he does decide to attack it aggressively, right? I mean, he could just maybe prioritize control a little bit more and, look to conserve his cardio. But I do think that if he's aggressively hunting the submission, he could find the sub here. So I'm going to go with Vieira, round one submission. And in the next fight, we have Umar Nurmagomedov versus Nate Maness. And Nurmagomedov's the minus 700 favorite. Maness is the plus 450 underdog. And, yeah, so the line is, it's pretty wide here, but I do think the breakdown is pretty straightforward here. With Maness, he is primarily a boxer, definitely seems to have a bit of power in his hands, but I'd say his best attribute is probably his toughness. He's had two, somewhat impressive comeback wins in the UFC. He was hurt pretty badly early against Sanders and Gravely in that first round, but was able to come back later in the fight and, get the knockout against these guys. Sanders was doing a bit of damage to him early, but Gravely actually had Maness hurt pretty badly at the end of the first. Arguably could have gotten the stoppage, but he was able to survive. So Maness definitely showing a lot of toughness in those fights. But going forward, I don't know if that's something you could consistently rely on, especially against better opponents that won't gas out as well, right? Because the thing with Gravely and Sanders is these are guys who are a bit of front runners where if they aren't able to get you out of there early, they will start to slow down as the fight progresses. And, he is going up against a very good fighter here in Umar, who, in my opinion, is probably, the best Dagestani fighter coming out of that camp, or best Dagestani prospect coming out of that camp, I should say. Very well-rounded fighter, on the feet. He's got a very nasty kicking game, very technical, very fast snapping kicks. Decent hands as well, but, I'd say his kicking game is really where it's at. And obviously the guy can wrestle as well, very good chain wrestling. He was able to dominate another very good wrestler and grappler in Morozov, made pretty quick work of Kelleher. And on top of that, the cardio seems pretty good for Umar. I've seen him, push it 3 rounds pretty consistently. So with Umar, I do think he's a legitimate prospect, and I do think he gets it done at a pretty high clip here. The striking, it is pretty interesting between the two, right? Maness, I think, is probably the better pure boxer, and Umar, while he does have a really good kicking game, I do think his hands are a bit underdeveloped compared to the rest of his game, compared to his kicks, compared to his wrestling. But, I'd say even with his B game, I think Umar can make it very competitive. Obviously, he has the wrestling in his back pocket, so, if things ever get out of hand, or, if he ever just feels like taking Maness down, I do think it's something that he could use to just completely seal the deal here. So, with that, I think Umar could just look to take over the fight at any point. He could kind of entertain the striking a little bit, if he wanted to work on his hands a little bit. But, I feel like as soon as he decides that, he wants to take over this fight, he could just hit the wrestling because, Munoz, who, fought Maness, I believe, in his debut, was able to get almost, 10 minutes of control time against Maness against the cage. And Umar is going to be the way better wrestler in this matchup. So if Munoz is able to take Maness down, if Munoz is able to control Maness for, 10 minutes in that fight, I think Umar should have no trouble doing so. And honestly, if Umar is able to get that much control time, he might even be able to get the finish as well. So, I like Umar quite a bit in the spot. I think that he's going to be the way more physical, way better wrestler. He should be able to take Maness down at will and kind of just have his way with him. I don't think Maness is a terrible fighter or anything, but, he kind of Homer Simpsoned his way into his last two wins and got a very favorable decision against Munoz, and I just don't really see that happening here. Umar, he has arguably taken a step down in competition too, right? You're going from facing guys like Morozov and Kelleher to Maness, who, again, not a terrible fighter, but, compared to those guys, I'd say he is a potential step down in competition. So, yeah, I think Umar gets it done by however he wants, honestly. I think he can keep it competitive on the feet with the striking. And then at any point, he could just go to the wrestling and just completely dominate from there. So, I like Umar in the spot. I'm looking at the line here, and honestly, I can't really argue with that too much. I'd say it's about right. You could argue that maybe Umar's like 85, 90% in this spot. So maybe even a little value on Umar. But I do think he gets it done. I think he gets it done. However, honestly, I think he could grind him out to a decision. I think he can maybe knock Maness out, ground and pound him or just submit him. So I'm going to go with Umar here. Umar by a pretty dominant performance. And in the next fight, we have Thiago Moisés versus Christos Giagos. And Moisés is the minus 235 favorite. Giagos is the plus 200 underdog. And we'll start with the big favorite in Moisés first. So, Moisés, pretty solid young fighter, known a bit more for his grappling, but I do think his striking overall is making some improvements. The guy is pretty dangerous on the mat, but the issue with that is, he can struggle a bit getting the fight there, and he doesn't seem to have the utmost urgency in getting fights there either, right? He does seem to be pretty content to just box in a lot of his fights, and, his boxing isn't bad, but he's just a very low volume guy, and, he does tend to get backed up a lot in fights as well. So, in my opinion, Moisés is a pretty inconsistent fighter. He's lost to some pretty legit guys, but I'd say some of his wins are a bit iffy as well. But, overall, he still is pretty dangerous on the mat, and if he can get the fight there, he can definitely, find a submission. But the issue is, of course, just getting the fight there, and overall, he's just not a very good minute winner. But he's going up against Giagos, who is, pretty well-rounded fighter, light on his feet, decent striking, good counters. He's got solid wrestling, but, he is pretty comfortable to strike. However, some of the red flags with Giagos is that, he has been submitted quite a bit. Granted, it's against higher-level guys, and he has been knocked out before, so, Giagos isn't exactly the most durable guy, and he is someone that, he is prone to just getting finished in fights. And, he does slow down as well, which, not a particularly great look, but taking a look at this fight, it's honestly kind of hard for me to get a great read on just because I do think this is a somewhat volatile fight. I do feel the line is a bit wide just because Moisés, he is a pretty low volume fighter. He's not great at winning minutes. And, if this plays out on the feet, I could see the forward pressure and the volume of Giagos being a bit much. But, Moisés, he does have, some submission upside. And, I think it's going to be competitive on the feet at the end of the day. Moisés, he is, pretty good defensively, but I just don't like how, he can back up and just shell up in spots. But I do think Moisés, he's got very real submission upside here. Giagos, he has been submitted on a few occasions, and Moisés is a dangerous submission grappler. But with that said, for as touted of a grappler that Moisés is, he's only gotten one sub in the UFC, and that was against Michael Johnson, where he kind of just dove on his ankles and was able to cinch up that ankle lock. But outside of that, he hasn't really shown much proclivity to want to grapple, actually. And if I'm being honest, Moisés actually hasn't looked fantastic in the UFC. He tends to just fight really close, regardless of, the opponent. Like, just looking back at a few of his most recent wins, Alexander Hernandez, he definitely overperformed in the sense that, he was a decent-sized underdog and he still, pulled off the win. But, it was a very close fight. It was like a 29-28 decision. I don't think Moisés really ever pulled away in that fight. And then against Bobby Green as well, pulled off another upset. But, he arguably lost that fight. And really, it was Bobby Green kind of just throwing that fight as well, right? So, arguably should have lost that fight. Was getting pieced up by Michael Johnson, was able to get that Hail Mary submission. And then he did beat Holloway pretty decisively, but, Holloway no longer with the UFC and not a great fighter to begin with. So, yeah, my issues with Moisés is, I just don't think you could really trust him at chalk here, I think it's best when you're able to bet Moisés as like an underdog, like he was against Bobby Green, like he was against Hernandez and against Johnson. But, as a big juiced favorite like this, I just don't think it's really worth it. Because, he's not really going to fight for your money, if I'm being honest. So the pick is Moisés. I think it's competitive on the feet, but I think Moisés could, pull off a submission here at any point, especially against Giagos. But I do think Giagos might actually be the value side. He could just win like a volume-based decision or something. But yeah, I still think I have to side with the favorite in Moisés. I just think the line is a bit wide, but Moisés has got to be the pick here. And moving along, we have a really low-level heavyweight fight here between Alan Baudot and Josh Parisian. And Baudot is the slight favorite at -115, Parisian -105. So, near pick'em here. But, we'll start with Parisian, just a very slow, plotty heavyweight. He does have a decent low kick and clinch game, but really the guy's just super slow on the feet. He loads up big on a lot of his punches and strikes. Very poor striking defense as well, and just very poor takedown defense and ground game from Parisian. He is dangerous on top, but I'd say that's more so just because the guy's massive. If he's able to get on top of these lower level guys, he's able to just aggressively throw ground and pound and get them out of there. But with Parisian, he is someone that does slow down. He does seem to be able to fight through the fatigue, but I'd say the movement just gets extremely labored for him, even more so than it originally is, past that first round and a half or so. And with Baudot, he is primarily a striker, decent movement actually for a heavyweight, decent lateral movement. Does seem to have a little bit of power, pretty quick hands. But, with Baudot, he doesn't really have much of a ground game either. Takedown defense is okay, but, if you get him on his back, he's going to be in a bit of trouble. And lastly, with Baudot, he is prone to slowing down and quitting in there as well. But taking a look at this matchup, I kind of do favor Baudot at distance. I think he's going to be the quicker fighter for sure. I think he's actually the more technical striker as well, right? And, I do think overall he's got better power and footwork than Parisian. Now, I do think that Parisian can maybe have some success, making it a very grueling fight, right? He could, just clinch up with Baudot, land some elbows on him, dirty box with him, maybe hit a takedown. But, the issue that I do have with Parisian is one, he's, kind of slow in there. And while he has shown that he can hit takedowns, he's not really all that good with it. Baudot, while he does look bad off his back, he does seem to have, decent first level takedown defense. And Parisian, I don't think is someone that will look to just chain takedowns together or anything. So on the feet, I can just see Baudot getting the better of Parisian. I think he's going to be beating Parisian to the punch. I think he's going to be just much better at distance, managing the range, being a little quicker. And skill for skill, I just think that Baudot is the better fighter. But, Parisian definitely can make this a dirty fight. And Maybe if he's able to get on top of Baudot, he could pound him out. Baudot is liable to just quit in there. So I do think that can happen. But, I see this largely being a stand-up affair with maybe a little bit of clinch work. And, in that case, I kind of favor Baudot to just land the better shots. So I'm going to go with Baudot here to win a decision, likely a split. But, yeah, I'm going to go with Baudot. I know he gets memed a lot, and, people aren't very high on him. But, I really don't think Parisian's a good fighter either. I think both are pretty bad. But I'm going to go with Baudot here. I think he's just the more skilled fighter, and I do think he's got the tools to win this fight. So I'm going to go with Baudot by split decision. And in the next fight, we have Magny versus Shavkat Rachmanov, and Rachmanov's the minus 360 favorite. Magny is the plus 285 underdog. And here we have your typical, hype prospect versus your proven veteran here. But, we'll start with the veteran in Magny. So with Magny, he is a very tall, rangy striker, very good pace and output on the feet, uses his length very well to keep opponents at distance, just an all-around, solid fighter, very well-rounded, can take the fight anywhere. However, he does do his best work when he's able to really mix in the grappling and the clinch work, really likes to put his weight on opponents against the cage. If he's able to take them down, he's very heavy on top. And, he's got the cardio to back it up as well. A lot of the time, he's able to just completely outpace opponents, if they're not able to keep up with him. In terms of the grappling, he kind of just touches him at distance, put his weight on him, and really make him work over the course of 3 rounds. And he's going up against Rachmanov, who is, very high prospect, but you do have to be a little wary because the guy's just an absolute finishing machine, which makes him dangerous. But, you do have to wonder how he's going to look, as fights get extended, which, we haven't really gotten a good look at, even at the UFC level. But with Rachmanov, he does seem to have quite a bit of power in his hands. He is a bit flat-footed on the feet, but, he does have a very pressure-heavy style. He's got pretty good timing on this spinning hook kick that he likes to throw. Was able to knock Carlston Harris out with it, or at least hurt him pretty bad, and then finish it up or follow it up with some ground and pound. But, even on the regionals, it's something he's looking for, and he has actually hit a few times before. So it is something to look out for with Shavkat. The guy, again, is very heavy-handed. Some of the shots he was landing on Oliveira and Prazeres, it looked like they had just a ton of impact on him. And on top of that, he does seem like a very competent grappler. He's got a sneaky guillotine and does seem to have a very strong top game as well. However, like I was saying before, there definitely are some red flags when it comes to Rachmanov here. Obviously, the guy's a big-time finisher, but, we don't really see him extended beyond that first round too much. He does have a few second-round finishes and maybe, I think, a couple third-round finishes, but for the most part, he's getting guys out of there pretty early. And I'd still say he is somewhat unproven, and, I only say somewhat because, he did beat a couple vets, in Oliveira and Prazeres, which, are solid wins, and he did do it in, I'd say, pretty dominant fashion, but I'd say there still is a bit of a question mark, right? Because Oliveira, while he is a proven UFC fighter, he is someone who has shown that he will quit in there. And Prazeres is, I'd say, a pretty undersized welterweight, and he is kind of old as well. That said, though, I still really have liked what I've seen from Rachmanov. I think the kid could be the real deal, but this is, I'd say, a pretty big step up in competition against a pretty proven fighter in Magny here. But, taking a look at this matchup, Magny kind of thrives when he's able to make his opponents fight his game plan, where he's able to kind of work at distance, pick out his opponents and then get in close to work the grappling, work the clinch. However, guys that have been able to kind of avoid that, keep it where they're strong, they're able to beat Magny, like Chiesa, for example, was able to, out-grapple Magny and, control him. Ponzinibbio was able to keep it at striking distance and, just be able to outstrike Magny. He was the quicker guy, better footwork. RDA, better grappler, was able to out-grapple Magny. So, you have to wonder if Rachmanov is going to be able to implement his game plan, and I kind of feel that, he might be able to. Rachmanov, I think, is a very big, very strong physical guy. I think that, his pressure-heavy style could give Magny a bit of trouble. I don't know if Magny's going to be able to just, clinch up with Rachmanov and, put his weight on him like he has against some of his other fighters. He might be because, Oliveira, was having a bit of success in the clinch. So, Magny, he might have some, success in the clinch, but I think, at distance, at striking range, I think Rachmanov could potentially, hurt Magny. I don't think Magny's got the best durability. He's been hurt by Max Griffin in his most recent fight, and he's been knocked out and hurt before as well. So I do think that with a heavy hitter like Rachmanov, something could get through, and he could hurt Magny. I think, potentially he could get on top of Magny, but, it is really hard to tell because Rachmanov, he did look good on top of Prazeres, but like I was saying before, Prazeres, older fighter, very undersized for the division. And I think Magny might be able to put up a lot more resistance, if he is taken down, but again, very hard to tell here. And overall, I just feel like there are still a number of unknowns about Rachmanov, even though he did look good in his 3 UFC fights. He did beat, 3, I'd say, pretty good fighters. But overall, I'd still have a lot of questions that, need to be answered when it comes to Rachmanov here. But I do think he's got a lot of potential. And I think I am going to pick him to win here. I think he knocks Magny out in that first round. I'd say, I think he could get his hands on Magny and hurt him pretty badly. So I'm going to go with Rachmanov by round 1 knockout. But I don't think I could bet him at minus 360 here, especially against a very proven veteran in Magny. And, who knows how he's going to look, later in that second and third round. Whereas, with Magny, we know that the guy is capable of, pouring it on in those later rounds. So, I honestly don't hate a bet on Magny here, especially as the line's starting to get a bit wide. But official pick, I'm going to go with Rachmanov to get the early knockout. And in the main event, we have Arman Tsarukyan versus Mateusz Gamrot, and Tsarukyan is the minus 240 favorite. Gamrot is the plus 205 underdog. And we'll start with the underdog in Gamrot first, who, he is a very well-rounded fighter. Gamrot, he's got pretty decent striking, but of course he does his best job, I think, when he's able to mix in the wrestling. He likes to really attack that single leg and kind of just work from there. And Gamrot, he is actually very reliable to wrestle. I think he's been able to hit a takedown in every single one of his UFC fights. And, even on the regionals, the guy's doing a really good job of mixing in the wrestling with his striking. He's got good cardio, he's able to sustain that sort of pace for, 3 and 5 rounds, right? He hasn't fought any 5-rounders at the UFC level, but he does have, a decent amount of 5-round experience on the regionals. So I do think he's got a lot of experience there, knowing how to pace himself for those 5 rounds. And I just think that overall, Gamrot's just a really good point fighter. He knows what the judges are looking for. Like, I don't think he's the most damaging striker or, like an elite wrestler or anything, but he just does a good job of, knowing when to mix what in and doing enough to win on the cards that way. But I do have some concerns with Gamrot's game. One, like I was saying before, I don't think he's, a phenomenal striker or anything. I don't think he's got really that much power on the feet. I know he did get a knockout on Holtzman, but I think at that point Holtzman's chin was, pretty compromised. And I know technically he got a finish on Diego Ferreira as well, but that was a really weird finish. I think Diego supposedly had like a broken rib going into that fight, and all he did was land one knee, and Diego Ferreira won it out in that fight. So overall, I'm just not really sold on the power of Gamrot. And even if you're watching some of his regional fights and some of his earlier fights, he's just, I don't know, he's touching opponents on the feet, but he's not really hurting them or really putting a big stamp in fights. And when it comes to the wrestling as well, he's not really great at controlling opponents either. But since he's so competent everywhere the fight goes, he's able to kind of just control the pace and how the fight goes. And it's worked for him really, really well so far. But he's going to be going up against Tsarukyan, who is a very good wrestler himself. I do think the striking is a bit of a work in progress still. He's got a nice jab counter left, but really I'd say his wrestling and pace that he sets is really what puts him apart. The guy's got great chain wrestling. He's very strong, very physical in the grappling. He's got great cardio as well. We've seen him sustain that sort of pace for 3 rounds and not really look all that tired. So I think we can kind of extrapolate on that and say that, he shouldn't have too much of an issue fighting 5 rounds. Obviously, it's not guaranteed or anything, but I do think that there's a good chance, he's not going to gas out come that 4th and 5th round. But, taking a look at this matchup, I do think it's a very fascinating matchup because, it'll be really interesting to see how the grappling exchanges play out. On the feet, I think that Gamrot's probably the more polished striker, but, I don't think it'll be an absolute outclass or anything. I do think that Tsarukyan should be able to hang on the feet. And both guys, I think, are pretty good wrestlers, but I think what really sets them apart is, I think the physicality. Gamrot, while he is a solid wrestler, I think, he does have a hard time controlling opponents and really just imposing his grappling. Like it's kind of hard to explain, but I think wrestling for him is more of just a means to score points. I don't think he's just a very dominant or physical wrestler, if that makes sense. Like, we're taking a look at some of, his fights at the UFC level, right? In the Guram fight, he hits 5 takedowns and only manages to get about 3 minutes of control time and ultimately, loses that fight. Regardless of how you felt about it, it was still a very close affair. Holtzman, he was able to get a couple takedowns on Holtzman and only about 1 minute of control time. Granted, he was able to knock Holtzman out, but, he wasn't really doing too much with the takedowns. Stevens, that was a very solid performance, was able to just get on top of him and find the submission. But, Stevens, I think is a little washed at this point. And then against Carlos Diego Ferreira, 4 takedowns, but only about a minute of control time. That said, you can argue CDF, he's a very good grappler, very good scrambler. So, of course, he's not going to be giving up that much control time. But, these are all things that, I think will come into play here, because Gamrot, he is a very good grappler as well. Very hard to hold down, as we saw in his fight against Islam. So while I do think that Gamrot, may be able to hit takedowns here, I don't think he'll get that much control time off. Whereas, if we're looking at Tsarukyan here, Tsarukyan, I think, is, much more aggressive with his takedowns, and I just think that he's a way more dominant wrestler, right? Like, he's able to impose himself a lot more and really put a stamp on fights with his wrestling and grappling, as opposed to Gamrot, who's kind of doing it to score points. Because, you look at Tsarukyan's fights, we look at his most recent fight against Alvarez, was able to hit 2 takedowns and, get 6 minutes of control times in a 7-minute fight. And, he eventually gets to finish that fight, right? It was a very dominant performance from Tsarukyan. And then you watch his fight against Frivola. He hits 10 takedowns and gets almost 8 minutes of control time. Against OAM, 2 takedowns, 8 minutes of control time. So, Tsarukyan, I think he does a much better job of holding opponents down and, overall just does, a lot more damage with his control time than, say, Gamrot. And defensively, Tsarukyan is really tough to hold down as well, like I was saying before. I think he's only been taken down and held down by Makhachev. And even then, Makhachev had a really tough time of, holding him down as well. And I know a lot of people are saying that, Tsarukyan's kind of just been riding off the coattails of, fighting Islam very, very competitively, which, I can't argue with too much, but at the end of the day, I'd still say it was a very impressive performance, all things given, right? Tsarukyan, that was when he was, 22 years old, making his UFC debut on short notice against a very touted wrestler in Makhachev. And, Makhachev, he's on his way to challenging for the belt soon here. So it's a performance that I think has aged very, very well for Tsarukyan. And it was a good performance even at the time. But you're watching Makhachev go out here and just run through guys like Hooker and Green, and we see a 22-year-old Tsarukyan on short notice in his debut put up a lot more resistance than these proven veterans. Kind of just speaks to how developed the grappling and the wrestling of Tsarukyan really is. And this is, I think, 3-4 years later, Tsarukyan's gotten a lot more, UFC reps. He's fought a lot more guys and, has dominated them. So, Tsarukyan, I do think has a lot more potential in this fight. I think that, we're seeing him make improvements fight to fight as well. Gamrot, I think, is a little more of, completed product, coming out of the regionals, going 5 rounds there already. I feel like most of his game has, been fully developed there. Whereas with Tsarukyan, I do think that, he's still making improvements fight to fight. So as far as a pure pick goes, I'm going to go with Tsarukyan, likely to win by decision. I think this fight probably does go to decision as well. I don't think either guy's a phenomenal finisher. Both guys have shown, pretty good cardio and durability. So, I can see this just being a very competitive, just grueling fight, for 5 rounds. But I got to go Tsarukyan here. I think he's the better wrestler. I think he's the more physical guy here. And, I do think that he should be able to maybe hit takedowns on Gamrot as well. Gamrot, I could see being, maybe the value side, just because, one, he's a bit closer to his prime, or, you can even argue he's in his prime right now. He's gone 5 rounds before, and, he's probably the better striker. So if he's able to keep it standing, he could just win in the striking. But I just see Tsarukyan being able to implement his wrestling and be able to win at least 3 rounds that way. And, I don't think that Gamrot's going to be like a significantly better striker to the point where he's going to be able to do enough on the feet to offset what Tsarukyan's going to be able to do on the ground here. So I'm going to go with Tsarukyan here. Tsarukyan to win by unanimous decision. And that will do it for the breakdown portion of the podcast. We just broke down the full card for UFC Fight Night, Tsarukyan versus Gamrot. And this will lead us right into the recap for the previous card in Kattar versus Emmett. And right off the bat, took a big L with Giagos getting knocked out there. Unfortunate to have not seen the fight play out a little bit longer. I thought Giagos, he'd have a little more success going in rounds 2 and round 3. But, of course, Dolidze, he is live to get those early knockouts. Really impressed with how high his knee went up to get Giagos there. A lot of guys can't even kick that high, let alone, get their knee all the way up there. So good knockout for Dolidze. Obviously really would have liked to seen the fight play out more, but, sometimes it's just how it is. Moving along, Phil Hawes versus Duran Win, and, was definitely on the Hawes side. Thought he'd have a pretty significant advantage in terms of the boxing. And if Win isn't able to take him down, which he wasn't able to, he'd struggle a bit on the feet. And, Hawes just absolutely pieced him up. Win showed a lot of toughness in that fight, but at the end of the day, he's just way too small for the division. He's just eating heavy shots from, guys much bigger than him. And, against guys who are well-versed in terms of the wrestling and the grappling, he's going to have a much harder time taking them down and holding them down. So, not really sure what Win is going to do moving forward, but, I don't think he's long for this division. And, on the Haas side, he looked really good, put on an absolute clinic, but I really wouldn't overrate him going into or out of this performance just because I feel like a lot of the reads about him haven't really changed too much. I still have concerns about the cardio and the durability of Haas. It's just that he fought a way smaller guy whose main path to victory is going to be in the wrestling, hitting takedowns, someone who isn't super dangerous on the feet. So I don't know if we really learned too much about Haas aside from the fact that, he's got good boxing, but, I feel like we kind of knew that already going into this fight. Really it was just the cardio and the chin is, that's the big concern with Haas. But moving along, Eddie Wineland, Cody Stamann. Was on the Stamann side, came out guns blazing and was able to just get Wineland out of there. Not entirely surprised. I know Stamann is a big-time decisionator, but, going up against someone who is, I'd say, pretty washed, someone whose chin is completely gone, not a surprising outcome whatsoever. And, I felt like Stamann probably knew that, which is why he came out so aggressively. You don't really see that from Stamann. Solid win there, but not a very surprising result. But moving along, Maria Oliveira, Gloria DePaula. So this result was a little surprising just because I really did not rate Oliveira as a striker, and I still don't. I mean, she showed a lot of regression in this fight, but I still think DePaul is the more technical fighter. It's just that it seemed like the forward pressure of Oliveira, her throwing like 10-punch combinations probably, swayed the judges a little bit more, even though she really wasn't landing too much more. But at the end of the day, it is a pretty low-level women's fight, and I guess I just had too much faith in DePaula to be able to pull it off. But we move along, Ricardo Ramos versus Danny Chavez, and I was on the Ramos side, just felt he was a bit better everywhere, fought better guys, the younger fighter as well. And, he does have a knack for hitting these, spinning attacks, although, with how aggressively he was going for those spinning heel kicks early in the fight, I wasn't sure if he'd land something just because it looked like he kept going back to the well with it, getting a little predictable, but, that ending combination where he kind of, fake going to the body and then just went around with like a spinning elbow. That was very, very nice setup there. But outside of that, not much else to say about this fight. Court McGee, Jeremiah Wells. I was on the McGee side, but ended up passing just because it did feel like a pretty high variance fight. Obviously didn't really see it play out, but, we do know with Wells, the guy's got fight ending power, and, he was able to land a pretty clean shot on Magny, which, it looked like a pretty nasty knockout too. But yeah, that was the concern with, Magny going into this fight is, he has been hurt before, and, he doesn't exactly have the best striking defense. And on top of that, Wells, he is a very big, strong physical guy who could grapple as well too. So the fight probably would have played out a little differently had it gotten extended. But, Wells, he is live for these knockouts early. So we move along. Jasmine Jasdavicius versus Natalia Silva. And I was on the Silva side pre-fight. Just felt that, outside of the physicality that, she'd just be the better fighter everywhere. But didn't think she'd be that much better, honestly. She looked very sharp in there. Was able to piece up Jasdavicius at distance, stuff the takedowns, work her way back up and even, hit some trips and get some top control time of her own. Just showed that she was the more skilled fighter overall. And honestly, if it wasn't for the size and the physicality discrepancy, I think that Silva probably could have gotten the finish or at least, beat up Jasdavicius a lot more. But, we move along. Adrian Yanez, Tony Kelly. I was on the Yanez side, but took a small shot on Kelly to win by decision. Felt that, if he had made it to a decision, he might have made it close with his, volume and output and maybe even some of his wrestling. But Yanez was not having any of that. Was able to get his timing down pretty early in the fight. And, he did a great job of, catching the kick and countering. And, Yanez did a great job of ripping to the body as well, kind of Aldo-esque with the way he was, going for those body shots. But, just a very solid performance from Yanez. He still is a little hittable, but, not going to complain too much. I mean, the guy is very good offensively. I think it more than makes up for it, but, would like to see him shore it up a little bit. But moving along, Julian Marquez, Gregory Rodriguez. I had a little action on, I think, Marquez. Scorecards, no action, and then a little bit on Rodriguez to win by submission as well. Obviously, neither of those cashed because Rodriguez was able to get the early knockout. I was really kind of banking on the toughness of Marquez there. I knew he'd eat some shots, but, the guy's shown some really good durability. Thought that he might be able to survive the decision. And, if not, I felt that Rodriguez, who is a black belt in jiu-jitsu, much better grappler here, might not have been able to knock out someone like Marquez, tough guy. So usually when that happens, you're going to have to look for the neck or something. And, he'd opt for a submission. And, at one point he did take his back, but decided to just drop hammers instead and just get Marquez out of there. So really dominant performance by Rodriguez overall. I mean, he just completely dismantled Marquez here, and it didn't look like Marquez was able to do anything. Didn't look like he got any significant offense off either. Was pretty much in survival mode after like the first 30 seconds or so. But moving along, Demir Ismagulov, Guram Kutetaladze. And I was on the Demir side. Obviously, the fight did play out a bit closer than I had expected it to. I thought that there'd be a bit more volume on the Demir side and a bit more of a technical advantage, but it was a very close fight, very competitive. Looked like Demir was maybe respecting the power of Guram a bit there. Anyways, we move along. Joaquin Buckley, Albert Duraev, and I was on the Duraev side. I thought he'd have a bit more success going to the wrestling and the grappling. Obviously, wanted to play on the feet a little bit, but ended up, taking a bit too much damage there. But ultimately, I don't think it would have mattered too much. Buckley actually showed pretty good takedown defense, pretty good get-ups. So I don't know if Duraev would have been able to sustain that sort of, pace for, 2+ rounds. So even if Duraev, was hitting takedowns early, I still think that Buckley's likely to find that later knockout, maybe in the second or third round or later in the third round. So not a great read there. Definitely overrated the wrestling and the cardio of Duraev there. But yeah, we move along. Tim Means, Kevin Holland. Was on the Holland side. Liked him to win by submission as well, too, which was at, I think, a pretty ridiculous number. But this was a fight that, kind of played out the way I expected it to. I thought it'd be, kind of competitive until Holland started landing some heavy shots. And, Means at this stage in his career just not very durable. The chin's a bit shaky. And usually when he's hurt, he's going to dive in for a takedown. a bit recklessly. And again, with someone like Holland who's got those long, lanky arms, he's going to be looking for those guillotines and those Darce chokes, and was able to cinch it up in that second round. So solid performance from Holland. But, I'd still kind of have some doubts about him, at 170, especially when he's going to go up against, I'd say, some higher caliber fighters. Cowboy Oliveira and Tim Means are legit fighters, but they're two guys who are on their way out. So, would be really interested to see how Holland's going to fare against other top 15 guys in the division. But moving along, in the main event, we had Calvin Kattar, Josh Emmett. So, I had a pretty big bet on Kattar, and it would have been a solid night had he have won. But at the end of the day, it was a very close fight. I honestly expected Kattar to have a lot more volume in this fight, but it seemed like, the power of Emmett was really getting to him, really stifled the volume from Kattar until a bit later in the fight. But, it felt like it might have been a little too late at that point. Personally, I felt that Kattar did win the second round, and I had him winning the fourth and the fifth. So, I kind of had Kattar edging it, but as big of a favorite as he was, it definitely was not the side to be on. Definitely a bit disappointing just because I felt it was a very winnable fight for Kattar had he shown just a little more aggression. Very easily could have swung one of the earlier rounds for sure, but it is what it is, and we move on. But that'll do it for this episode of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll catch you guys next week.